There are stories the mountains hold on to. Not the ones told around trading post fires, not the ones printed in almanacs or laughed over by men descending from the high country with fur-laden bags and silver-filled pockets, craving whiskey and warm rooms. I'm referring to the other kind of story. The kind a man carries home deep in his bones and never speaks of, not even to his own wife, not even to the priest who visits once a season to bless the cabin. He stays silent because uttering it aloud might be what summons it back, and calling it back after a man has finally made it home from those mountains is the worst sin he could ever commit against himself. Tonight, I'd like to share one of those stories with you. But before I do, I want to ask you something. Wherever you might be listening from right now, take a moment and tell me in the comments. Share the name of the place, the town, the country, the road. If there's no town, that's fine too. I read every single one, and I'm always amazed at where this voice ends up at 300 in the morning. I want to know who's out there with me tonight, and I have one more request before we start. Down in the video description, and pinned at the top of the comments, you'll find something called the Appalachian Dossier. It's a compilation we've assembled of accounts that were quietly removed from official American records between 1843 and 1891. Accounts that no longer appear in the archives because someone took them out. The link is right there waiting for you. Open it before you forget. Open it now if you can. Some of what you're about to hear connects to those records in ways that took us years to piece together, and I don't want you to miss it. Good? Take a breath. Now lean back. Turn the lamp down a little if you're able. If you're walking, slow your steps. If you're driving, find a place to sit with this for a while. Because this story isn't the kind you let pass through you in a hurry. This story belongs to a man named Wendelin Krauthammer. He was 68 years old when he finally agreed to commit it to paper. He was a trapper and a guide in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana. He'd been working those mountains since he was a young man of 21. By the time he wrote this account, he'd lived alone in a cabin above the west fork of the Bitterroot River for nearly 40 years. He knew the country the way other men know the rooms of their own homes. He knew which springs ran sweet and which ran iron. He knew the names the Salish had given the peaks long before any white man came up the valley with a pack mule. He knew in his hands, his feet, and his nose where the elk would be in October and where the wolves would not go in February. He didn't drink. He didn't lie. The men who knew him said that if Wendelin told you the creek would freeze on Tuesday, you set your pack accordingly. He wrote his account in the late autumn of 1895, 8 years after the events I'm about to share with you. And he gave the pages to a Methodist circuit writer named Reverend Autocarve, with the strict instruction that the manuscript wasn't to be opened until after his death. Wendelin died in the deep cold of January in the year 1903. The Reverend opened the envelope. He read it once all the way through, sitting at his kitchen table in the small parsonage at Stevensville. And then, by his own admission in his private journal, he sat at that table for the better part of 2 days without moving. He didn't eat. He didn't answer the door. His wife, a patient woman named Wilhelmina, finally came in and placed a hand on his shoulder and asked if she should send for the doctor. He told her no. He told her he'd been given something to read that had rearranged the way he understood the world, and he needed a little time before he'd be fit company again. This is what Wendelin wrote. It began in the late summer of 1887, in the high country south of Lost Horse Creek. Wendelin had been running a long trap line that year. Working his way up toward the basin he called Quiet Bowl, he'd given the place that name himself more than a decade before, because of a peculiar property it had. When you stepped down into the bowl from the saddle above, every sound from the outside world ceased. The wind kept moving. You could see the pines bending. You could see the long grass laying down under it, but you couldn't hear it. The world went silent the way a room goes silent when the last person in it stops talking. He'd known about the bowl for 15 years and had never thought much of it. Strange acoustics happen in stone country. He had a friend out near the Sapphire Range who knew of a meadow where you could clap your hands and the echo came back from above instead of around. He'd heard from a Nez Perce guide he worked with sometimes of a stretch of canyon where a man's own voice would answer him a full second after he'd finished speaking, with the tone changed as if someone else were saying his words for him. The high country has its oddities. A man learns to nod at them and move on. What Wendelin hadn't known, and what he wrote about with a careful and sober hand, was that the bowl wasn't always quiet. That summer, he reached the rim around the middle of the afternoon on the 3rd of August. The sky was the color of old denim, and the air was so still he could hear his own heart in his ears. He had 2 mules behind him, both packed heavy with traps and salt and the small comforts of a long trip. The lead mule, a heavy gray jenny, he'd named Anis after the apostle, stopped at the saddle and wouldn't go forward. He didn't push her. In 30-some years of mountain work, he'd learned that when a mule refuses, the mule has reasons. He tied them both to a stunted limber pine just below the ridge and walked down into the bowl alone with his Sharps rifle across his arm and his old beaver felt hat pulled low against the sun. Halfway down the slope, he realized he could hear the wind. Just for a second, just a regular sound of wind in needles, the small dry whisper of pine. And then it stopped and the silence pressed back in around him. And he was inside the bowl proper, where the world held its breath. He made a note of it in his head. Strange, worth thinking about later. He set up a small camp at the lower edge of the bowl near a clear spring that came up out of the rocks and poured into a small stone basin and made no sound at all when it fell. He'd stayed in this camp before. He'd drunk from this spring before. He knew the spring. He knew it usually splashed. It didn't splash that day. He drank from it anyway. The water was cold and tasted of granite the way it always had, and he let himself believe for a few minutes that he was being a foolish old man getting spooked by a quiet afternoon. He gathered some dead branches. He laid them. He started a small fire. He noticed as he watched the flames climb that the fire made no sound either. No crack of pitch, no hiss of sap. The flames moved like the flames of a fire underwater, with the world muffled around them. He put coffee on. The coffee didn't gurgle when it boiled. It simply at some point was hot. Then the dog showed up. Now, I should tell you something. Wendelin didn't have a dog with him on that trip. He never traveled with one in the late summer because his old pointer, a red and white animal named Carmody, had died the previous winter, and he hadn't yet found the stomach to take on another. He was alone. The mules were a quarter-mile uphill. There were no other men in the bowl because there were no other men within 40 miles in any direction. The nearest cabin was his own, and his own was a hard day's ride to the south. But there, walking out of the timber on the far side of the spring, was a dog. It looked like a black collie, the kind some of the Scottish ranchers up around Hamilton kept for their sheep. It had the long, fine fur, the white blaze on the chest, the slim, intelligent face. It moved across the grass in the casual, unhurried way that a dog moves through ground it knows. And it didn't look at Wendelin at all. He watched it. The dog walked to the edge of the spring, lowered its head, seemed to drink, but the spring made no sound. And the dog made no sound either. Not the lap of a tongue. Not the soft pad of feet on packed earth. Not the small shake a dog gives when a fly lands on its shoulder. Not the quiet click of a claw against stone. Nothing. Wendelin sat very still on his bedroll and watched the animal. He counted to 40 in his head slowly, the way his mother had taught him to count when he was afraid as a young man back in Pennsylvania. The dog drank for the entire count without ever raising its head, without ever pausing, without ever doing the small quick check that any real dog does, that any real animal does, when it knows another living thing is sitting 12 feet away. Then it raised its head and it looked at him. This is the part of the manuscript where Wendelin's handwriting changes. The Reverend noted this in his journal in some detail. Up until that line, the writing had been steady and even, the writing of a careful man recording careful facts. After that line, the letters leaned forward as if the pen were being pushed by a hand that had begun to hurry, and the lines run a little crooked, as if the writer couldn't quite hold himself still. He wrote, "Its eyes were not the eyes of a dog. They were not the eyes of any animal I have known in these mountains. They were the eyes of something that had been pretending." The dog held his gaze for what he estimated was the better part of a minute, long enough that he stopped counting, long enough that the fire burned down a little, long enough that he became aware, in some quiet animal part of himself, that he'd stopped breathing. Then the thing turned, walked back into the timber, and was gone. Wendelin didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back to a boulder and his rifle across his knees, and he watched the bull until the gray of dawn came up over the eastern ridge. The mules were quiet up at the saddle. The wind moved in the pines and made no sound. The spring fell into its pool and made no sound. And somewhere out in the timber 3 separate times, during the long hours, he heard a dog shake itself the way a dog does when its coat is wet. But he'd heard nothing else from that animal. Not a footfall, not a breath, not the small huff of warm air it would have made on a cold night. Only the shake. He left the bowl at first light and didn't return for the rest of that season. He told himself as he walked the mules down the long switchback toward his cabin that he'd seen a stray. Some rancher's herd dog wandered up too high. The strange acoustics of the bowl had played a trick on him. He was tired. He'd been alone too long. He was getting on in years, and his eyes weren't what they'd been. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. But the lie got him home. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, I want to pause here for a moment. This story is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you've made it this far without subscribing, do me a small favor and tap that button now, because there are accounts coming up in the next few weeks that I think you'll want to hear. And if you happen to be listening to this story on a channel that isn't the fear behind you, then someone has taken our work without our permission, and I'd be grateful if you'd report it to us. We work hard on these. We'd like to keep them ours. While you're at it, take another look at that pinned comment. The Appalachian Dossier is sitting there. The records erased between 1843 and 1891. Some of those accounts are about places like the one Wendelin walked into. Some of them are about creatures the rangers no longer have words for. It's in the description and the pinned comment. Open it before you forget. Now, let me get back to Wendelin. The winter of 1887 was a hard one. The snow came early in the middle of October, and it came deep, and the trail to Wendelin's cabin was closed off from the lower valleys for nearly 5 months. He'd laid in his usual stores. He had wood stacked head high under the eaves. He had a barrel of salt pork, and another of dry beans, and a sack of coffee that would last him to the thaw. He had 3 good books and a Bible, and a deck of cards he played solitaire with by the lamp. He wasn't afraid of the winter. He was afraid, however, of going back to sleep, because 3 nights after he came home from the bowl, in the small hours when the cabin was creaking under the weight of the early snow, he heard a dog shake itself just outside his door. He had no dog. He sat up in his bunk. He listened. A minute passed, then he heard it again. The unmistakable sound of an animal flinging water from its coat. The rapid wet flap of fur against bone, except there was no water because everything outside was frozen solid and had been for 2 days. He could see the moon through the smallmanary window over his table, and the night was clear and dry and so cold that the nails in the walls were popping like small pistols going off in the boards. He took his rifle off the pegs above the door. He stood beside the door. He waited. Nothing else came. No scratch, no whine, no paw against the wood. No breath. After a long time, he heard very faintly what he believed to be the sound of something walking away across the crust of the snow. But the snow outside his cabin was 3 feet deep and crusted hard, and a real dog walking on it would have made the snap and crack of breaking rind, the soft thump of body weight punching through. This made no such sound. It was lighter than that. It was wrong. It was the sound a thing would make if it weighed almost nothing, or if it weren't quite touching the ground. In the morning, he went outside with the rifle. He walked the perimeter of the cabin 3 times around. He found no tracks, not a single mark in the snow. He stood in the cold sunlight and stared at the unbroken white and tried to make sense of it. Then he went back inside and stoked the fire and made coffee and tried to think about other things. He didn't succeed. The shaking happened 7 more times that winter, always at night, always within 10 or 15 feet of the cabin, always on snow that in the morning lay smooth and unmarked. He tried twice to be quick and yanked the door open in the middle of it. Both times, the snow was empty. Both times, when he held the lantern out into the cold, there was nothing. No animal, no tracks. Only the shape of the cabin in the moonlight, and the trees, and the long blue silence of a winter night in the Bitterroot. By the time the thaw came in late April, Wendelin had lost 12 pounds, and his hair had gone almost entirely white at the temples, where it had been only streaked before. He came down to the settlement at Derby for supplies in the middle of May, and the postmaster, a long-jawed man named Folklore, took one look at him and asked if he'd been sick. He told Folklore he'd been sick. He didn't tell him what with. What he wanted more than anything else was to talk to someone who might know, someone who'd spent as much time in those mountains as he had. There was, in the town of Stevensville, an old French-Canadian trapper named Theophrastus Russell, who'd come down out of Canada in the 1840s and had worked the Bitterroot and the sapphires longer than any white man living. Theophrastus was, by Wendelin's reckoning, somewhere on the high side of 80 years old. He lived in a single-room shack behind the livery stable, and he didn't speak to most people. He'd outlived 2 wives, one daughter who'd married a man back east, and most of his teeth. But he'd spoken to Wendelin once, 10 years before, about a stretch of country up near Trapper Peak that Wendelin had asked him about. The old man had looked at him for a long time with those watery old eyes that gave away almost nothing, and had said, in his careful broken English, "Do not camp there. Do not even cross there if you can go around. The country has a memory, and that memory is not friendly." Wendelin had taken the advice. He'd never camped near Trapper Peak. He'd always gone around. And in the years since, on 3 separate occasions, he'd heard of men who hadn't gone around, and who'd come out of that country with their hair gone white in patches, or with a stutter they hadn't had before, or, in one case, who hadn't come out at all. So, in May of 1888, after a winter of shaking sounds and empty snow, Wendelin rode down to Stevensville and went to find Theophrastus Roussel. The old man was sitting on a stump behind the livery, mending a snowshoe. His eyes were the color of weak tea, and his hands moved on the raw-wide webbing with a slow, certain rhythm. He didn't look up when Wendelin came around the corner. He said in French, "You took a long time to come." Wendelin asked him what he meant. Theophrastus said, still without looking up, "I knew you would come the day. I heard you went up into the bowl alone." He set the snowshoe down. He looked at Wendelin for the first time, and his eyes, behind the watery old age of them, were entirely sober and entirely afraid. He said, "Set, I will tell you what I know. I will tell you only once. After I tell you, I will not speak of it again, and you will not ask me. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Wendelin sat. The old man told him this. There were in the high country of the Bitterroot certain places that didn't belong to the world, the way the rest of the country belonged to it. He didn't have a name for them in English. The Salish people he'd known in his younger days had a word for them that meant roughly, the standing still. These were small patches of ground, sometimes a meadow, sometimes a basin, sometimes only a stretch of trail, no longer than a man could throw a stone, where time and sound and the rules of the living world worked differently. A man could enter one and not know it, the way a man can step into deep water without knowing it, until the bottom is gone. In those places, things waited. Theophrastus didn't know what they were. He'd seen them only twice in his life, and on both occasions he'd walked away the moment he understood what he was looking at, and he'd never returned. He believed, though he couldn't prove, that they were old. He believed they'd been in those mountains before the Salish, before the Shoshone, before the first man with a face had come down out of the north into that country. Older than the trees, older possibly than the rocks. The mountains had grown up around them, the way a tree grows up around an iron nail driven into its trunk when it was a sapling. They were, he said, very good at pretending. When a man entered one of their places, they would offer him something familiar, a friend, a horse, a dog. Whatever the man had loved or whatever the man had lost, they would shape themselves into it, and they would let him approach. If the man approached, they took him. Not his body necessarily. His body might walk out of that place and live another 40 years. But something else was taken, and the man would never again be entirely himself. And he would carry for the rest of his life a small piece of that place with him. The place would never let him go. It would visit him. It would make small sounds at his door at night. It would remind him that it was waiting. It would, at the end of his life, when he was tired and his guard was down, try one final time to bring him back to itself. Theophrastus said, "It will not stop. It does not know how to stop. It is not cruel, you understand. It does not hate you. It is hungry in a way that is not hunger. And it has found you." Wendelin asked him if there was anything to be done. The old man considered for a long time. He picked up the snowshoe again. He worked the rawhide between his fingers. Finally, he said, 3 rules. Listen carefully. I will not say them again. Do not look at it when it comes. Do not speak to it. Do not name it. Because if you give it a name, the name becomes the rope between you, and it and the rope cannot be cut. And do not ever, ever, ever follow the sound out of the cabin. If you go outside to find it, you will find it, and that will be the end of you. Wendelin nodded. Theophrastus said one more thing. He said, "And do not bring another person into your house. Do not let another man sleep under your roof, because what has found you will become curious about him, and you will have done him a harm he did not deserve." He picked up the snowshoe again. He went back to mending it. Wendelin sat for another minute. He thanked the old man. He stood. He walked back to his horse. He never saw Theophrastus Roussel again. The old man died in the autumn of that year of pneumonia in his shack behind the livery with a rosary in one hand and an unfinished snowshoe in the other. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it for a moment before you answer in the comments. Have you ever been in a place? Just a place, maybe a hallway in your own house, maybe a stretch of road you've driven 100 times, where for no reason you understood, you suddenly knew that you shouldn't be there. You couldn't say why. You couldn't point to anything wrong, but the hair on your arms went up, and you knew in a way that had nothing to do with thinking that you needed to leave. Tell me about it down below. I want to read everyone, because I have a quiet suspicion, after years of doing this, that Theophrastus was right, that there are places, and that more of us have brushed against them than we like to admit. All right? Wendelin went home to his cabin above the West Fork. He did the things the old man had told him to do. He didn't look. He didn't speak. He didn't, in his own head or out loud, give the visitor a name. He didn't so much as call it, the thing, in his journal for fear that even that small label might bind him to it. He referred to it, when he had to refer to it at all, as what comes. And for a while, it seemed to be enough. The shakings, when they came less often. Once a week. Once a month. Once that whole second winter, on the longest night of the year, and not again until the following spring. He started to believe that the old man's advice had worked. That by refusing to feed the thing with attention, he was starving it. And that eventually it would let go and find something else to follow. He was wrong about that. But he believed it for a few years, and those were good years. In the summer of 1890, against every word of warning Theophrastus had given him, he took on a young apprentice. His name was Oberon Talifer. He was 24 years old. He'd come west from a small town in eastern Pennsylvania with the idea of making his fortune in the fur trade, 10 years too late, with no real understanding of how late he was. He was a tall, thin, soft-spoken fellow with a long brown beard, and the kind of pale, freckled hands that had never done hard work until that summer. He carried a Bible, and a small daguerreotype of his dead mother in a tin frame. And he had a way of laughing at his own clumsiness that made him impossible to dislike. Wendelin met him at the Derby store, where the young man had been asking, politely and without much luck, whether anyone needed a partner for the season. In Wendelin's estimation, Oberon was hopeless. He didn't know how to set a trap. He didn't know how to read sign. He'd never skinned anything larger than a rabbit. But he was eager, and he was kind. And Wendelin had been alone too long, and the warning of an old French, Canadian trapper, 3 years dead, had begun to feel like the warning of a dream a man could no longer quite remember. He brought Oberon up to the cabin, and he taught him the trade. He didn't, of course, tell Oberon about the bowl. He didn't tell him about the shaking. He didn't tell him about Theophrastus Roussel or the places that waited. He told himself this was kindness. Why burden a young man with a story he didn't need? Why frighten him out of a livelihood he'd come 1,000 miles to learn? He told himself this. He believed it. He was wrong about that, too. The first sign that something had attached itself came in the September of that year. Wendelin and Oberon were running a line up near a ridge they called Owl's Tooth, about 6 miles north of the cabin. They'd been out for 2 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, while Wendelin was reading the wind off a creek, Oberon said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, "Wendelin, did you hear a dog just now?" Wendelin's hand stopped on the strap of his pack. He said, "No," Oberon said. "I thought I heard one shake itself up the slope." Wendelin turned very slowly, and he looked at the young man. Oberon's face was open and untroubled. He was looking up at the ridge with mild, easy curiosity, the way a man looks at any small, slightly out-of-place thing in the woods. Wendelin said, "There are no dogs up here." Oberon said, "I could have sworn." They went on with the work. That night in their camp, Wendelin sat awake for hours after Oberon had gone to sleep. He watched the young man's face in the firelight. He watched it for a long, long time. He was looking, though he couldn't have explained it then, for some sign that something had attached itself. Some small wrongness, some shadow under the skin, some moment when Oberon's face in the flicker of the flames would settle into a shape that wasn't entirely his own. He didn't see one. He told himself again that he was being a foolish old man, and he tried to sleep. In the morning, Oberon was the same Oberon. Cheerful, slow with his hands, asking too many questions about the proper way to set a marten trap. Wendelin began to think he'd imagined the whole thing. But 2 weeks later, back at the cabin, Oberon mentioned at supper that he'd been hearing the past few nights what sounded like a dog shaking itself just outside the cabin wall. He said it casually, the way a man mentions a leaky shingle or a loose nail in a floorboard. He said, "Do you have a stray that comes through here sometimes? I keep hearing it. It is a little spooky if I'm honest with you." Wendelin set down his fork. He looked at the young man across the table, and he understood with a cold and terrible clarity that he'd made a mistake the size of a mountain. He'd brought another person into the cabin where the visitor came, the cabin where the shakings happened. He'd let a young, ignorant, trusting man sleep within those walls without warning him, without telling him not to look, without telling him not to speak, without telling him, above all, not to follow the sound outside. And now the visitor had taken an interest. He told Oberon that night the whole story. He told him about the bowl. He told him about the dog at the spring. He told him about the long winter of empty tracks. He told him what Theophrastus Roussel had said. He told him at the end the rule about following the sound. And he made the young man swear to him on his mother's grave that he'd never go outside the cabin in the dark to find what was making it. Oberon, by the end, was the color of old paper. His hands were shaking on the table. His coffee had gone cold in front of him. He swore. Wendelin believed him. That was his second mistake. I'm going to slow down here for a moment because what comes next is the hardest part of the manuscript to read. And it was, I believe, the hardest part for Wendelin to write. The Reverend's journal notes that the handwriting in this section is shaky and uneven, and that several pages are stained, possibly with tears, possibly with something else. I'm going to tell it to you the way Wendelin told it. Plain, without embellishment, because the embellishment isn't necessary, and because the plain version is worse. The autumn went by. The winter came down hard. They settled into the routine of a long mountain winter together, 2 men in a 1-room cabin. And they got on well enough. Oberon learned to skin and stretch. He learned to read the sky. He learned that the silence of a Bitterroot January is a kind of presence, not an absence, and that a man who can't make peace with it will go mad before the thaw. The shakings came. They came more often than they had in years, sometimes twice in a night. Oberon, to his credit, did exactly what he'd been told. He didn't look. He didn't speak. He didn't name it. When the sound came, he turned his face to the wall, and he counted his breaths until it passed. Wendelin, watching him in the lamplight on those nights, was proud of him. He thought, this young man is going to be all right. We are going to get through this winter together. And in the spring, I'm going to send him down to the valley with my blessing, and the visitor will lose interest in him because he never gave it anything to hold on to. It was a good plan. It worked until the night of the 14th of February. The night of the 14th was clear and very cold. The moon was 3/4 full. The wind had been blowing all afternoon and had stopped at sundown, and the cabin was so quiet that Wendelin could hear the small ticking of his own pocket watch on the table. The fire was low. The lamp was out. Both men were in their bunks, awake but not speaking in the way two men who've shared a cabin all winter sometimes lie awake together, without needing words. The shaking started a little after midnight. It was different that night. It was closer than it had ever been. It was right against the door on the outside, and it wasn't a single shake the way it usually was, but a continuous one. The sound of a wet animal flinging itself dry over and over for minutes on end, hard against the wood, as if the thing were standing on the threshold and wouldn't stop. Wendelin lay in his bunk with his face to the wall. Oberon, on the cot across the room, did the same. Wendelin could hear the young man's breathing. It was fast and shallow. He could hear him counting under his breath, the soft murmur of numbers. The way a frightened man holds on to a small known thing. The shaking went on. And then, after maybe a quarter of an hour, it stopped. There was a silence so complete that Wendelin could hear Oberon's heartbeat from across the room. And then, softly, through the door came a voice. It was a woman's voice. It said one word. It said, "Oberon." Wendelin's whole body went cold. From the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, the cold of pure terror went through him. Not because he recognized the voice. He'd never heard it before in his life. But Oberon, on the cot across the room, made a sound in his throat like an animal that's been struck, and he sat up. And he was looking at the door. Wendelin said very quietly, "Don't." Oberon said, "It is my mother." Wendelin said, "It is not." Oberon said, "It is. I would know her voice anywhere. She died when I was 19, Wendelin. That is her voice. That is exactly her voice. She used to call me from the kitchen just like that, when the bread was ready and I was reading too long up in my room. That is her." Wendelin sat up. His hands were shaking. He swung his legs out of the bunk and put his feet on the cold floor. He said, "Oberon, listen to me. Whatever is out there, it is not your mother. Your mother is at peace. Your mother is in the ground in Pennsylvania. Whatever is out there is using her voice because it has been listening to you every night for almost 6 months. It has been listening to you breathe. It has been listening to you dream. It knows what would call you. It knows the one word in the world that would make you stand up. Do not open the door." The voice came again. It said, "Oberon, my love, it is so cold out here. Please, please, sweetheart, just open the door." Oberon was crying now, silently. The tears were running down his face in the moonlight from the window, and his mouth was open, and his hands were on the edge of the cot, and he was staring at the door, as if there were nothing else in the world. Wendelin got out of the bunk. He moved between Oberon and the door. He held out his hands. He said, "Look at me, Oberon. Look at my face. I am the man you have lived with for almost 2 years. I am the man who has fed you and taught you, and stood in the snow with you, until your fingers turned white. I have not lied to you once in all that time. I am telling you now on my own life that whatever is out there is going to take you away from yourself if you go to it. You will not survive it. You will walk out into that snow, and you'll walk a long, long way. And the man who comes back, if any man comes back, will not be you. Look at me. Do not look at the door. Look at me." Oberon looked at him. His eyes in the lamplight were not entirely his own. There was something behind them, something that was looking out through them, the way a man looks out through the windows of a house at dusk. There was a presence there sharing the space, and it was deciding. But there was also still Oberon, some piece of him. The piece that had laughed at his own clumsiness. The piece that read his Bible by the lamp every night before sleep. The piece that had sworn on his mother's grave. That piece looked at Wendelin, and it seemed to understand. He sat back down on the cot. The voice came once more. It said, "Oberon, I have been waiting so long. I am so cold. Please." He didn't answer it. After a long time, the voice stopped. The shaking didn't come back. They sat in the cabin, the two of them, and watched the door and didn't sleep until the gray of dawn came up over the eastern ridge. In the morning, Wendelin opened the door. There were no tracks. Of course, there were no tracks. There were never any tracks. Oberon went outside and stood in the cold sunlight and put his hands on his face and wept for almost an hour. Wendelin stood beside him and didn't speak. He didn't put a hand on the young man's shoulder. He didn't offer comfort. He understood that what Oberon was crying for was something larger than the night that had passed. He was crying for his mother, who'd been dead for 5 years. He was crying for the version of himself that had walked into that cabin 2 summers before and would never quite walk out of it the same. He was crying because he'd heard, with his own ears, the worst possible thing, and he hadn't been able to refuse it on his own. He'd needed another man to refuse it for him. When the young man was finished, he said, "I want to leave, Wendelin. I want to leave today." Wendelin said, "I know. I will take you down." They packed the mules. They started down the trail. They reached the lower valley 3 days later, and Wendelin saw Oberon onto the southbound stage at Darby with a letter of recommendation and what cash he could spare. Oberon shook his hand at the stage door. He said, "I am sorry." Wendelin said, "Don't be. You did what almost no man could have done. You heard her. You did not go." Oberon got on the stage. He went back to Pennsylvania. He wrote Wendelin one letter the following summer to say that he'd married a widow named Hortense and was working in her father's hardware store, and that, on the whole, he was well. He added, in a postscript at the bottom of the page, that he still heard the shaking sometimes, not often, once or twice a year, always on cold, clear nights. He'd learned to sleep through it. He thanked Wendelin in the same postscript for what he'd done that February. He said simply, "You stood between me and her. I do not have the words. Thank you." Wendelin kept that letter for the rest of his life. The Reverend found it folded into the back pages of the manuscript. The fold was worn soft as cloth from being opened and closed many times. So, that's most of the story. There's a little more. I want to tell you the rest of it carefully, because the rest of it is the part Wendelin struggled with most, and the part the Reverend, in his own private journal, couldn't bring himself to write down for almost a year. Wendelin went back to the cabin alone in the spring of 1891. He lived there for the next 12 years. He never took on another apprentice. He never invited another man to stay the night. When other trappers came up the trail hoping for shelter, he would meet them outside the door, share his coffee on the porch, and send them politely back down the mountain before sundown. He earned a reputation in those last years as a hard old man. People said he'd gone strange in the head. People said the high country had finally taken its toll. He didn't mind. The reputation kept them away. The reputation kept them safe. The shakings came sometimes. He turned his face to the wall and counted his breaths. He never opened the door to them. He never spoke to them. He never gave them a name in his head or on the page, or to the Reverend who came up the trail twice a year to bring him books and the small comfort of human company. But, in the last year of his life, in the autumn of 1902 and into the winter that followed, something changed. He was by then an old man of 76, slow on his feet and thin in the chest, and he knew the winter coming was likely to be his last. He'd begun that summer to put his small affairs in order. He'd written his will on the back of an old trapping ledger. He'd set aside a little cash in a tin under the floorboards with a note specifying that it was to go to Oberon Talifer in Pennsylvania with his thanks. He'd cleaned and oiled his Sharps rifle one last time and hung it back on the pegs above the door. He was at peace with going. He'd made his accommodations. What he hadn't made his accommodations with was the sound that began coming in those last weeks. Out of the timber behind the cabin. It was no longer the sound of a dog shaking itself. It was the sound of his own voice. He would be sitting at his table, mending a trap or reading the Bible the Reverend had given him, and he would hear from somewhere out in the trees his own voice calling out a single word. Sometimes it was his own name. Sometimes it was the name of the Jenny mule, Onesimus, who'd died many years before. Sometimes, and these were the worst, it was a single word he hadn't said aloud, since he was a boy of 7 or 8 in his mother's kitchen back in Pennsylvania. A word from the German his mother had spoken when she was happy. When the bread was on the table, and the lamp was lit, and her own mother was visiting from across town. A small soft word that meant more or less. Come. He wrote near the end of the manuscript that he understood what was happening. The visitor had been with him for 16 years. It had been listening. It had been learning him. It had heard every word he'd ever said inside that cabin. And it had heard somehow every word he'd ever said in his whole long life. And now, at the end of that life, it had finally figured out the one shape that would bring him outside. It had figured out how to be him. He wrote, "I am tired. I am very tired. The voice in the trees is very kind. It calls me by the name my mother used. It calls me to come home. It says that supper is ready. It says that I have been gone a long time, and that everyone has missed me, and that there is a chair set for me at the table by the window where I always used to sit." He wrote, "I will not go. I have promised the old Frenchman, may his soul be in light, that I will not go. I will die in this cabin, in this bunk, with the door closed. And the visitor will have to find someone else to listen to." And then he wrote one more line, the last line of the manuscript. He wrote, "But I confess, my friend, that I have begun to wonder in the small hours whether what calls from the trees is the visitor pretending to be me, or whether the visitor and I have become the same thing over these long years, and I am only finally calling myself home." That's where the manuscript ends. The Reverend, after he read it, rode up to the cabin in the late spring of 1903, the moment the trail was passable. The cabin was closed. The door was barred from the inside. He had to break the door to get in. Wendelin was in his bunk. His face was turned to the wall. His hands were folded on his chest in the way a man folds his hands for prayer or for burial. The cabin was tidy. The fire was long out, the coals gray and powdery in the stove. The Bible was on the table open to the 8th chapter of Romans, with a small dried sprig of mountain sage laid across the page as a marker. The Sharps rifle was on its pegs. The tin of cash was under the floorboard with the note for Oberon. He'd been dead, the Reverend estimated, for somewhere between 2 and 4 months. The body was undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry. There were no tracks in the old or the new snow anywhere within sight of the building. The Reverend buried him on the small rise behind the cabin under a limber pine, and he put a wooden cross there with the name and the dates carved into it with a knife. He took the manuscript and the letter from Oberon and a few small personal effects, and he rode back down the mountain. He sent the cash and the note to Pennsylvania. He received, 3 months later, A short letter back from Oberon Talifer thanking him and saying that he'd used the money to buy a stone for his mother's grave. The Reverend didn't, by his own admission in his journal, sleep well for the rest of that year. The cabin is gone now. It was struck by lightning in the dry summer of 1922, and it burned to the foundation in a single afternoon. The cross is gone, taken by weather and time. The trail is gone, grown over with lodgepole and huckleberry. The bowl, the Wendelin called Quiet Bowl, is still there, somewhere south of Lost Horse Creek. And on the topographical maps it has no name, because no one who's been there has ever wanted to put one on it. But there's a thing the Forest Service rangers in that district sometimes mention to each other off the record, when the talk turns to the unexplained. They mention that there's a stretch of country in the high Bitterroot south of the creek, where solo hikers occasionally come back changed. Not hurt, not lost, changed. They come out a day late or 2 days late, and they sit in the ranger station, and they drink the coffee, and they answer the questions, and they seem on the surface fine. But sometimes, the rangers say, those hikers will mention almost in passing that they had a strange experience up on the trail. They will say that they heard a dog shake itself somewhere in the timber, and there was no dog. Or they will say they heard a voice call their name from a place where no one was. They'll laugh about it. They'll say the mountains play tricks on the ear at altitude. The rangers nod, they smile, they let the hiker go on home. But they make a quiet note in the log, just a name, just a date. Just the location on the map, and once or twice a year somewhere in that district. Somewhere in the country Wendelin Krauthammer, trapped for 40 winters, one of those names will turn up again. Not as a hiker, as a missing person. The family will call. The search teams will go out. The dogs will lose the scent every time, at the same elevation in the same kind of country, near a clear spring, in a small basin, where the wind moves in the pines and makes no sound. The rangers don't talk about this part with the public. But the log is there if you knew where to look. If you had the right friend in the right office, who'd drunk enough coffee on the right night, you might be allowed to read it. So that's the story. I want to leave you before we go with one small thing Wendelin wrote in the margin of his manuscript in a different ink and a slightly different hand, as if he'd added it later. The Reverend noted it specifically in his journal. He believed it had been written in the last week of the old trapper's life. Wendelin wrote, "If you hear it shake, do not look. If you hear a voice you love, do not answer. And if one night you hear your own voice calling you out into the dark, then I am sorry, my friend. I am very sorry. Because that is the night you have to be the strongest you have ever been. And there is no one I can send to help you. I have nothing to add to that. If you've made it all the way here, all the way to the end of this long story, thank you for staying with me. These long accounts aren't for everyone, and the fact that you sat through this one means something to me. It means we're the same kind of person, you and I, the kind who would rather sit in the quiet and listen than keep busy, than keep noisy, than keep distracted. Tell me in the comments whether you believe Theophrastus. Russell was right. Whether there are places in the world where time and sound and the ordinary rules don't apply. I have my own opinion after years of reading these accounts. I'd rather hear yours first. And before you close the video, go down to the description. Open the Appalachian Dossier. The link is pinned in the top comment, as well if that's easier. There are accounts in there that I think will sit with you tonight. One of them, the one from 1873, out of a small holler in eastern Kentucky, has a detail in it that lines up with Wendelin's manuscript in a way I still can't explain. A detail about a voice calling a name from a place where no one was. If you find it, come back and tell me. I'll be waiting. Until next time, friends. Sleep with the door closed. And if you hear something shake itself in the snow outside, don't look.